All right. Last night, I went and saw a girls' high school varsity basketball game. Uh, Two good teams. Both have players playing Division One basketball this year. They graduated from their schools last year. Both teams featured girls who will likely play in college next year. So, two good teams, pretty well coached, decent high school basketball. Um, as I watched, there were a couple times players were in good defensive position. So for the first, an offensive player made a move, first 1 to 2 dribbles, the defensive players, right there, in front, starting to get onto their hip. And if that offensive player took that third dribble and really kind of forced the action or put their shoulder down and really tried to drive to the basket, they beat the defensive player almost every time. And what I noticed is every time they got beat, either giving up a lane to the basket or ultimately fouling the player, they were shuffling or using a defensive slide, to use the basketball terminology. So they never transitioned from their defensive slide into a crossover step. And so I tweeted about this last night and received some questions. So I just wanted to explain that. So if you're playing defense, the goal would be to use a defensive slide. However, you want to think about that, but essentially a lateral movement where your feet do not cross. Unfortunately, that movement is not going to be fast enough to stay in front of an offensive player who's going at full speed, okay, or who's running. All right, so out in front, when you're in good defensive position, by all means, don't cross your feet, just stay in front. Shuffle back and forth, slide back and forth, and you're fine. But when that offensive player really tries to attack and starts to get an advantage on the defensive player, if the defensive player continues to shuffle, they will get beat. There's just nobody who's going to shuffle as fast as somebody else is going to run. And so when I was young, I was taught you move from your defensive slide, and when you got beat, then you turned and sprint. Okay? But there's a transition movement called crossover stepping that you can use so you maintain the same type of body posture towards the offensive player. So I'm moving laterally instead of running, but I'm crossing my feet. So my trail foot moves in front of my front foot, and then I step out with my front foot. Crossover stepping allows me to cover a lot more ground than I could just with a regular shuffle or slide. And so rather than turn and run and give up the positioning advantage of being kind of squared to the defensive player in a lateral movement, and instead having to run shoulder to shoulder, I maintain that kind of position advantage, but I'm able to move faster. And so it's a transition movement, so it's not something that you would use, let's say, like the length of the court. It's something that you would use, take 1, 2, maybe 3 at the most crossover steps. And if you haven't caught up to a player, in a full court situation, then you need to turn and sprint. You're not going fast enough to get back in front. But in a half court situation, usually just takes 1 or 2 steps, and then you've either, the offensive players run out of room, or you've cut off the offensive player and they've had to do something else. So when you can, by all means, shuffle, slide, don't cross your feet. But once that offensive player starts to get that advantage, if you want to get back in front, okay, cross over. So drop your trail or move your trail foot in front of your front foot, and cover as much ground as possible on each step. And that's going to enable you to be quicker as a defensive player without giving up the kind of positioning that you have when you're shuffling laterally. I hope that helps. And hopefully tomorrow I'll have another video that maybe expands on this idea.